Heidegger's most strident critic is Levinus, whose thought is mobilized around a massive critique of ontology, the paradigmatic representatives of which are Hegel and Heidegger. Levinus's critique is cast, contra Heidegger, in language that has such an unmistakably biblical resonance that it occasioned Dominique Janicaud to complain about the theological turn it precipitated in French phenomenology. By ontology, Levinus understood a thinking that remains riveted to being, trapped inside the categories of being almost claustrophobically, against which he posed the necessity to escape by thinking what is otherwise than being. Being means the brutal order of reality, the way things are done in the world, what he and Nietzsche, following Spinoza, called in Latin the cognitus ascendi, but what is otherwise than being is the good in Greek, epikainos tes ousios, although definitely not in the strictly Platonic sense of an actual transcendent metaphysical structure, in a world beyond this world, about which Levinus was as atheistic as Nietzsche. By the good, he means something rather more than Kantian, than Platonic, the ought rather than the is. But all this is developed with a markedly biblical tone. Because God hides his face from us, we are turned to the face of the neighbor, which is marked by the trace of the withdrawn God, who is said to be wholly other. Now the perplexing thing about Levinus is how closely his thought approaches what might be called a death of God theology. Like Kant's Enlightenment critique of religion, Levinus thinks that religion is ethics, and the rest is superstition. God is nothing more than the very order that orders us to the neighbor. To turn to God is to be returned to the neighbor. God is the law, the moral order of things, a kind of ordo ordinans, but not a being outside time and space, lest God be contaminated by being. God is an interpretive issued from the depth of the face of the neighbor, but God is neither being itself nor some sort of higher being or person beyond the persons and beings that we encounter in reality. Our being turned to God is our being returned to the neighbor, and that is all the God there is. God commands, but God does not exist. About the separate and supreme being of classical theology, Levinus, the most theological resource of postmodern thinkers, is no less than Nietzsche, their most anti-theological resource, an atheist. Things certainly do not get less complicated with Derrida, who is, to all appearances, a secularized Jew and leftist intellectual who thinks that religion is a neurosis, and who says of himself that he rightly passes for an atheist. But it is in Derrida, more than in any other postmodern figure in contemporary philosophy, that the undecidability between theism and atheism is the most intense, and the distinction the most porous and unstable. For Derrida says that he prays all the time. He speaks of his faith in the pure messianic and of a religion without religion, and he adds that, while he rightly passes for an atheist, he has no way to know if he really is one. In his earlier writings, Derrida criticized the idea of God as a dream of plenitude, of presence without difference, that brings the play of signifiers to rest in an absolute foundation, as an attempt to find a refuge in the encyclopedic protection of theology. All this seems to implicate his critique of the metaphysics of presence, in religious skepticism, and perhaps outright atheism. At the very same time, Derrida was being accused of, or congratulated for, being a negative theologian. When he described difference as itself neither a word nor a concept, but the quasi-transcendental condition of possibility of words and concepts, that sounded to some a lot like the deus absconditus of negative theology. Both implications are incorrect. Difference, again this is different than difference. Difference withdraws from view not because it is a being beyond being, hyperousios, or a godhead beyond the God. In the manner of classical negative theology, it is elusive not because it is transcendent, but because it is a transcendental condition of possibility, a neutral condition that makes it possible either to affirm or deny or to withhold judgment about a God. But please note, it is a quasi-transcendental, not a new metaphysical center, which means it makes these things possible in just such a way as to see to it that whatever we say on behalf of or against God, we may have to unsay. Hence, our atheism may be inhabited from within by theological assurances, and our theology may be a disguised form of atheism. In short, there is no negative ontological argument against God implied in difference, nor is difference or difference to be confused with God. In his later writings, in which Derrida spoke of the affirmation of the undeconstructible, deconstruction began to look like itself a certain kind of atheological religion. In a now famous 1989 talk at the Cardozo Law School, he made a distinction between the law, which is a contingent positive historical construction, and hence deconstructible, or deconstructible in the sense that it is revisable or repealable, and justice in itself, which, if there is such a thing as justice, is not deconstructible. Without this revisability, the law would be an unyielding tyrant. So being able to deconstruct a law is a condition of its justice, while justice is that undeconstructible affirmative, something in the light of which laws get deconstructed. Justice, if there is such a thing, is not deconstructible. In a sense, there never is justice, since whatever is a conditioned positive law, and justice is what we desire, not necessarily what exists. Like Levinus's God, justice calls, but justice does not quite exist, except insofar as it acquires the force of law, and those deconstructible things we call more or less just positive laws. After 1989, Derrida analyzed a series of undeconstructible structures: the gift and forgiveness, hospitality and friendship, and most notably the democracy to come. Furthermore, the name of God, hitherto criticized as a theological term, the absolute center, the showstopper that arrests the play of signifiers and brings discourse to a full stop, a full presence, a transcendental signified, is taken as the name of a desire beyond desire, of a memory and a promise, a self-effacing name that tries to erase its own trace, and is, as such, precisely unarrestable. The name of God evokes endless substitution and translation, and is caught up with ineradicable undecidability. When the scripture says that God is love, we will never know whether that means that love is the best name we have for God, or that God is the best name we have for love, the latter being the atheistic position taken by many who often cast accounts of love in the attributes of religion and divinity. When Derrida was asked why he says he rightly passes for an atheist instead of simply saying, "I am an atheist," he said it is because he does not know. And by this he did not mean that he is personally confused about what he thinks. He meant, first of all, that there is always a number of competing voices within the self that says, "I believe," or "I do not believe," something of which are unconscious, so that we never achieve that kind of self-identity and self-transparency required by a simple ecological assertion. We never know to what extent our belief or disbelief is a disguised form either of its opposite or some third thing, but beyond that point of self-questioning, from a psychological point of view, he meant that the object of radical affirmation, the undeconstructible, is subject to an undecidable fluctuation in an open-ended future, a certain promise or threat in virtue of which we have no way to monitor the real distance between an atheist who affirms the justice to come and a religious believer who affirms the coming of a messianic age. Derrida distinguished the structural messianic and indeterminate affirmation of the to come from the determinate belief systems of the concrete messianisms. Such is Christianity, which awaits the second coming of Christ. The structural messianic is built unto deconstruction as the affirmation of undeconstructible, which gives deconstruction the formal structure of a certain religion without concrete confessional religion. The operative distinction, therefore, is deconstruction is not between theism and atheism, but between determinate and indeterminate objects of affirmation, the words theism or atheism being rather too simple to describe what is actually going on. That is why, when asked about the death of God, Derrida said that he does not believe in the simple death of anything. The permutations of which postmodern thought is capable are also strikingly illustrated by the paradox of the theological form atheism assumed in the 1960s and thereafter, principally in the Anglo-American world, in Death of God theology, in which we recognize a certain continuation of Feuerbach's transformational criticism of Hegel. The perplexing idea is to produce not a simple atheism in the manner of a David Hume or Bertrand Russell, but an atheistic theology, one with historical roots in theology itself. By this was meant an analysis of how the transcendence of God had become immanent in the world, so that the secular world could be sounded in terms of echoes left behind by the dead, or immanentized God, for which one would require a theological ear. The British version of the movement was marked by the appearance of Bishop John Robinson's bestseller, Honest to God, which begins with citations of Paul Tillich, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Rudolf Bultmann. And of course, these were certain theologians within theology. For Robinson, following Tillich, the Christian is today called on to recognize that God is neither a being up there in terms of pre-Copernican astronomy, nor something out there in terms of metaphysical transcendence. God is here amidst the joys and trials of human life, in the very ground of our being, and the only real atheist is one who denies that life has depth and seriousness. The movement's most sophisticated philosophical expression is the theological non-realism of Don Caputo. For Caputo, the word God does not pick out either Tillich's ground of being or some entity in reality who it answers to that name, but instead constitutes a focus, imaginarius, as George Pattison puts it, around which the strictly human project of autonomously configuring our spiritual values may be organized. In his later writings, under the influence of Derrida, he gravitated away from the language of an autonomous human subject as too modernist a formulation and adopted instead the postmodern, deconstructionist idea of a disseminated subject. The same shift from a modernist to a postmodernist version of Death of God theology, again under the influence of Derrida, can also be found in the United States as well. The best known of the older atheistic theologies in the United States is Thomas J.J. Altzier's The Gospel of Christian Atheism, which follows Hegel's view that the Jewish God is an alien and pure being, the religion of the Father, that is first negated by the Incarnation, the religion of the Son, and then suspended when the empirical reality of the Son, Jesus, breaks up the crucifixion in order that the divinity principle may be distributed among everyone, the post-Easter religion of the Spirit. While Hegel regarded Christianity as a picture story, or Vorstellung, like a series of stained windows of a conceptual truth that could be stated only in the metaphysics of absolute idealism, Alitzer holds in some more literal way that in an act of divine self-sacrifice, God abdicated transcendence, became flesh in Christ, and died on the cross, making purchase on an unspecified apocalyptic future. The baffling thing is that Altzier rejects both the Hegelian explanation that Christianity is simply a picture story needing to be demythologized by philosophy, and the distinctions introduced by Orthodox theology that the Son underwent a death in his human, but not in his divine nature. Althusser's position was criticized and reworked by Mark C. Taylor in the light of deconstruction. Taylor argued that Althusser was serving up another version of the metaphysics of presence, a dialectical presence or absence system in which everything is either simply dead or alive, simply absent or present, in which total death is the purchase price of total presence. In the book Erring, an Atheology, in 1984, the book that was for many the first introduction of the work of Derrida into theology, Taylor describes deconstruction as the hermeneutics of the death of God, by which he meant not the black or white modernist dialectics, but the nuanced undecidability of the atheological, in which the clean distinction between the theological and the atheistic is disrupted. Taylor's critique of Althusser is a parallel to the way that a Deleuzian would describe as still too theological or modernist. Robinson's Tillichian affirmation of the depth or ground of being, where even if God is no longer transcendent, God is still being deployed as a way to stabilize becoming as a grounding center of our being. But Taylor was, in turn, criticized for failing to adhere rigorously to the demands of the atheological program, for not maintaining the slash or undecidability between theology and atheism, and for simply allowing the theological to dissipate without remainder in a world of random play and bottomless chessboards. Taylor has gone on to write creatively about art, architecture, and the revolution in information technologies, about everything, it seems, except religion, since on his thesis, religion is present where it is not, and consequently to be read less and less by people who were interested in religion where it actually is present. Taylor's use of deconstruction in theology was guided largely by a certain reading of Derrida that was dominant in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, whereas recent work on deconstruction in religion takes its lead from Derrida's writings in the last 2 decades of his life. There, deconstruction is described in terms not of the endless play of signifiers, but of an affirmation of the impossible, of a desire beyond desire for the undeconstructable, so that deconstruction is structured like a certain faith or religion without religion. The secular theology of Charles Winquist was associated with the early Death of God movement, but in seizing on the idea of theological desire in his latter writings, Winquist entered into an interesting alliance with Deleuze, the later post-Airing deployment of deconstruction in theology. Gianni Vattimo, who earlier had been tracing the hermeneutics of nihilism, or of the death of God, in his recent writings has come to see in the breakup of the God of the old ontotheology a new life for Christianity as the religion of love, peace, and justice on earth, on the basis of which Vattimo has entered into a dialogue with Rorty's idea of democratic hope. The most recent chapter in the story of postmodern atheism is found in a reaction against the specific postmodern tendencies that I have singled out. Zizek complains that postmodernism is a kind of permissiveness in which anything is possible under the rubrics of identity politics, political correctness, liberalism, or capitalism. One of its most deplorable developments, he says, is the return of religion, not only fundamentalist religion and New Age religion, but even the religion without religion to be found within deconstruction itself, and hence the whole idea of post-secularism that we have been discussing. As an atheist, a Leninist, Zizek warns that the best way to combat all this obscurantism of religion is not to attack it frontally, but to employ the kind of Trojan horse strategy founding in the reading of St. Paul, which infiltrates the religious camp and boldly affirms the lineage from Christianity to Marxism, for example. Zizek sees a defense of Christianity against its postmodern corruptions as a model for the radical left, which must defend a hardy and radical Marxist-Leninism against its wimpish liberal humanist corruption. And so it exhibits, albeit in a strictly formal way, all the marks of a militant Marxist, personally galvanized by a singular, life-transforming event. He thinks that Paul set out with apostolic zeal to declare its truth, undertaking a worldwide mission to turn that singular event into a universal truth. For whatever is true for everyone, Greek or Jew, master or slave, male or female. Of course, this point is that Paul's truth, that of the resurrection of Christ, is a pure fable, that Paul is telling the Marxist truth in a mystified manner. Of course, in his own words, Zizek dialogues with Christian orthodoxy, both the older one of G.K. Chesterton and the more recent radical orthodoxy of John Milbank. Militant Christian orthodoxy is vastly to be preferred to deconstruction's religion without religion, as decision is to be preferred to undecidability, as substance to froth, as firmly affirmed truth to historical relativism, as real faith to skeptical dilly-dally. As in Hegel and Feuerbach, Christianity is the real truth, but in mythological form, and it needs only to clear its head with a few sessions on the couch with Lacan and a stirring speech by Lenin about the need to be heard. With whose help the theistic myth can be demythologized into concrete social truth, but as critical of postmodernism and deconstruction as Zizek is, He does not challenge the postmodernist claim that religion and atheism communicate with each other and share a common form of life. Taken in strictly philosophical terms, postmodernism is a sustained attempt to displace a fixed categorical opposition of theism and atheism to make trouble for both traditional religious faith and modern atheism. Postmodernists identify the ways these opposites turn on a common structure and explore the possibility of a certain region or even an affirmation that is indifferent to the difference between the theistic and the atheistic, or the religious and the secular. If critics like Zizek think that this arises from an anemic refusal to make decisions, thinkers like Derrida seem inspired by a kind of learned ignorance, believing that we are not hardwired to some metaphysical verity, hesitating in the name of peace before making determinate and militant declarations of belief or unbelief. They are moved, I think, by a hope or suspicion that there might be some other possibility, something atheological, beneath or beyond this dichotomy, something hidden, a hidden future that is concealed from all of us today. John D. Caputo.